This is the AHRMM Subject Matter Expert Podcast, hosted by Justin Poulin. Tune in every month as we speak with industry experts to highlight success stories and solutions from the field that advance the healthcare supply chain. And now, Justin Poulin with this month's expert.
Joining us this month for the AHRMM SME podcast is Matt Mentel, founder and strategic partner at Strategic Optimization and Innovation Partners, LLC. We're going to be talking about getting back to the basics in so many ways, core supply chain functions. How do we retool and focus our sites on logistics? There's a lot of conversations going on. We've actually had some recently about AI, and I can't think of the last time I didn't talk to a healthcare organization at some point during a week where I wasn't hearing about an ERP implementation, Matt. There's just a lot going on with technology, rightfully so, but we can only leverage those technologies if we are centering them around really excellent core practices in the supply chain. So it's always good to just reestablish that baseline. That's what you and I are here to talk about today. So I just want to welcome you to the AHRMM SME podcast series. And thanks so much for coming on to share your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you, Justin.
So Matt, why don't we talk a little bit about your 25-year career in supply chain? You've got a lot of experience behind you, and I think that's part of the reason why we have you on today.
Thank you. Yeah, 25 years. I was born in a hospital to stay there. I never left. That was kind of the plan, right? They just put a hat on me, gave me the supply chain shirt and said, start going. But no.
I think that'll be a much more common practice with what we're seeing around staffing these days.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. You brand them early.
So what are some of the areas of particular experience that you've had over those 25 years, and maybe some trends that kind of began when you were earlier in your career that have really just continued to stick over the years?
Sure. So I started my career with a CPA firm auditing nursing homes and hospitals. I came into supply chain from a finance perspective, trying to tool out supply chain in a sense of decision support. So when I entered supply chain 25 years ago, I had the benefit of joining a large not-for-profit health system that had an evolved supply chain. So we went down the ERP process and really looking to move the needle in supply chain. We were viewed as the point of the spear, an operationally sound way that led to sustainable savings through operational improvements, and leverage contracting as a mechanism there. However, less than 5 years ago when I left that organization and moved into my own practice, what I'm finding now is a very heavy focus on the financial side of what supply chain does. So many of the clients that are bringing me in bringing me in for contracting issues or how you optimize savings from leveraging of items, et cetera. Seldom for utilization, more so of contracting, and then also for procure to pay. So what I find in these engagements is digging deeper, the problem ends up being operational. Meaning we've really had some holes in our understanding of the very fundamental supply chain functions that exist out there, such as receiving or PAR optimization, inventory management, just really the tie to utilization, and understanding that writing a contract does not necessarily mean you yield financial benefits if the utilization doesn't match. I'd say what I'm seeing is a lot of fractured relationships, meaning the relationships with the clinical operations side of the business or finance or support areas is often tenuous, and we've verticalized or siloed ourselves very much. I spend a lot of time in value analysis, meaning the support mechanism that goes into contracting, but it really is the secondary mechanism that helps implement these contracts. Then finally, really not leveraging vendor relationships.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times, and I want to get your opinion on something too about how this has evolved over time, but I definitely feel like in many cases, we get the contract set up, but to your point about utilization, execution after the initial implementation, it just can be very difficult, especially if you're not leveraging technology in the right ways to manage, or I should say, to get a good viewpoint of contract utilization. then that can become a blind spot. But also with a staffing crisis, it's just how many different things can somebody monitor? And so I understand why the movement towards technology, but I think the other thing that's happened, which is to supply chain's benefit and really for the career, is that we've developed out, value analysis, strategic sourcing, these higher level positions. But we've also, to be able to staff that, we've taken some real rock stars that have been a little bit more intimately involved with the details and the day to day, and maybe even some of that, contract utilization post implementation. And we've pulled them and expanded their role, which is great. But I'm not sure that the talent coming in necessarily has been able to catch up to the upper level growth of supply chain. And especially since we've placed such an emphasis since the pandemic. Is that what you think is the underlying root cause of why we've maybe lost some sight of the core functionality, is just the demand on higher level talent?
Yeah, I think that's a piece of it. The other piece of it is this one-dimensional focus often does a couple things. One, you get leaders who are brought in from other professions like MDs to take over leadership of supply chain, which then takes the profession itself and has people, somewhat hit the eject button, right? They see their upward mobility stopped. So they go find a profession, or they go outside of healthcare, which, obviously is maybe more advanced in some ways, or in all ways. I think that's a piece of it. I think what you see as who and what structure supply chain falls under. So if it falls under a finance leader, and the finance leader is very financial driven, doesn't have a strong feeling of what supply chain brings, you'll see a very AP focused, or even the AP leader take over supply chain. And on the flip side, on operations, if you have an operations leader who doesn't really feel a strong desire to delve into what supply chain brings, you see them skew as well. So it creates this problem. Do you feel like,
I think it's important what you just said. It's kind of like there's a COO and there's a CFO, and the reporting structure has a great deal of influence on exactly how supply chain functions. Do you feel like certain aspects of supply chain should be collaboratively split in a way and have a separated reporting structure, like one to the COO and maybe other functions to the CFO? Or is there something else that should happen structurally in our supply chain organizations to keep up with this?
I believe supply chain should sit actually directly to the CEO myself, but I don't think you should split the functions. I think they are the most complete operational structure in a hospital. And I'm not in any way putting anyone down, but if you think about what we do from end to end, it's really everything from the doc to patient bedside and the support mechanism behind it. So seeing that visualization of what happens there, it gets lost. When you put a very financial head on it, we become very focused on how we make money through contracting. I should say make money, how we show money in a historical way through contracting that has not been fully vetted out through utilization.
So you think we need to move away from maybe stopping at the VP of supply chain level and actually elevate it to a chief supply chain officer who is working collaboratively with operations and finance, COO, CFO, the same way we see those two working collaboratively, because it's so essential to everything that's happening in a healthcare organization?
Either that, or you move to a matrix reporting structure where you share responsibility going to both. Right. I don't think bifurcating the supply chain is the right answer. You could have them report to a COO, CFO, and even CNO, I think. And that really kind of brings me to the next piece. We focused so many years on having and appeasing, I'd say, the physician side of the business, which is great. And it's important when you talk about high cost, high preference. But when you think through how we actually operationalize things, it is really that relationship with I'd say the non-physician clinical side. It is with physicians, but it's the non-physician clinical side that actually keeps it and makes it sustainable. So that's where your value analysis, and that's where the relationship becomes so important with really every aspect of the healthcare organization. So when I say it needs to be either directly to the CEO or in a matrix relationship, it is because of that ability to communicate across in the multiple ways in which people need to see its value. And I'll even pick on quality. Supply chain has a direct impact to quality. So each of these pieces play together, and if not having the direct access to each of those verticals across all the silos we've created causes a problem.
So one of the things we kind of I guess, started this off with was you mentioned getting brought into engagements because a lot of times the savings are just not being realized. And we talked a lot about technology, and I think there is a lot of focus on technology to help save us. But what's the gap here? Where is the hole between, hey, we're now investing in advanced technology and this is supposed to help us, and yet we're still fundamentally having an issue with realizing the savings? Where's the disconnect? What's the need that's not being met here?
Well, if I would rewind, back into the old days, 20 years ago, ERP systems came in and most of them were either financial driven. Actually, most of them were financial driven. And then, added on HR and you added on supply chain was almost always a tertiary thought. And I don't think anything's changed today. So what we've done, and I don't know an ERP system today that has a very strong supply chain element, but we've taken these elements and we've really said, okay, you're adopting this ERP system and supply chain, here's yours. And what we've done in supply chain is change our practices to match what the ERP system offers. And then what happens is we somewhat lose pieces of our practice and our profession in that. And then when we struggle to implement or we struggle to execute along the utilization side, there become holes and gaps. We have lost that skill set in some ways, or we don't get a chance to use it. And, I would say it's the one-dimensional nature I've talked about before. But on the flip side, if we can't work within the system, what you'll find is leaders of supply chain doing things in paper behind the scenes. I can't tell you how many times I see an Excel spreadsheet replacing something that is technically supposed to be part of the ERP system and then entering it after the fact. So our dependence on technology ends up in a loss in the core supply chain discipline.
So who's suffering the most here? I mean, if you can believe it, we're pretty close to the end of the interview, but I think we're barely starting the conversation in so many ways. But, to kind of tie this up a little bit, like, who's suffering the most? Is it these large health systems that are implementing the technology, but really having a hard time training the people that are trying to leverage it, to your point, still end up utilizing paper? Small to mid-size? And is that because of lack of technology adoption, or is it a different reason?
They can't go out and buy all the tools they need to augment the systems. The ERP systems aren't complete, especially when it comes to reporting or in the front end, the data cleanup piece. And so you end up buying other support systems to get there. And, the pandemic has made it worse. Allocations, substitutions, the evolution of technology that is one piece or one-offs that we tie together to make it all work. So while our awareness of the global supply chain is better, we've stopped communicating, or we've stopped actually bridging that gap. And then we've kind of focused internally, and then we go back to what's being asked of us, which is almost always a financial ask.
So putting myself in the shoes of somebody who's working in supply chain, or maybe they're the director of materials at a small to mid-sized hospital. We already know the financial pressures, right? The Accountable Care Act put a ton of stress, and that's why we saw so much, mergers and acquisitions and health systems growing to really financially insulate some of the smaller ones. But you still have a number of rural hospitals that really just don't fit in necessarily to a larger healthcare organization strategy geographically, right? And you think about critical access facilities. And so you also find yourself with a very small team wearing a lot of hats. And then, to your point, not necessarily being able to afford the technology that might help them, work more efficiently, essentially doing more with less staffing specifically is the part I want to call out there. What should we be doing both as an industry, but what should that person working in a small to mid-sized hospital be doing to help stay as caught up, as functional, optimal, and realizing the savings, knowing that if they can't realize those savings, they're really spinning their wheels or just continuing to lose ground? What should we be doing?
Well, I think we need to be cognizant of what our value is to the organization. I think the finance piece is important. I think a lot of times we function without key performance indicators. And if we have them, we don't explain them and what impact they have, both in a financial and operational sense. I think we need to leverage our professional knowledge and then set up ourselves so we are sharing and collaborating and facilitating our skill set in a way that supports the caregiver. So going back to why we're all here, it's around the caregiver, right? And supporting that patient. So pulling ourselves away from the one-dimensional ask and communicating our expertise in ways that are valuable for all our partners. And it means changing our communication to each of those different silos or verticals in such a way that they can appreciate what we bring to the table. And finally, I just say it's not all just contracting. It's an operational end-to-end understanding. And that's what brings us and makes us strategically valuable to all our partners.
Matt Mentel, everybody, founder and strategic partner at Strategic Optimization and Innovation Partners, LLC. Matt, you did a fine job on today's interview, and I want to thank you so much for coming on the AHRMM SME podcast.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
All right, everybody. Thank you for listening to this month's episode. Stay tuned. Another SME podcast coming next month. And don't forget the AHRMM Updates podcast, also every month with Mike Schiller. Thanks for listening today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the AHRMM Subject Matter Expert Podcast. For additional resources, visit our website at ahrmm.org. That's AHRMM.org. Tune in next month for another edition of the AHRMM Subject Matter Expert Podcast.